this is the only plan in the state for voting hours that we could get consensus from Democrats and Republicans on.
It calls for early voting Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 for the 4 weeks in October, as well as the last Saturday in October and the first Saturday in November, 8 to 4. But critics, including Peg Rosenfield of the League of Women Voters, say there should be evening hours, as well as some Sundays.
You may have just felt an odd sensation of chilling deja vu after seeing that very recent footage about voting hours in the still hugely decisive, perennial battleground state of Ohio. Because just like in those Terminator movies, when the seemingly defeated cyborg rises up to keep on terminating, the cold, calculating attempt to restrict voting has risen once again in the state of Ohio. In the hands of Ohio Secretary of State Jon Husted, we are in for a very serious sequel. You see, Mr. Husted, under the guise of uniformity, has set early voting hours that are standard for all the counties in Ohio. Here is the problem. The more populous counties really do need weeknights and extra weekend days to offer everyone a chance to vote without disastrously long lines. Here's Peg Rosenfield of the League of Women Voters.
About 8 or 10 urban counties who are the ones who need the extra hours, and we have 80 rural counties who don't need it. So I'm sure the rural counties are perfectly happy with these hours, and the urban counties have been outvoted.
And that gets to the heart of the problem. It is an unfortunate fact that in these pitched battles over voting rights, only one party has a clear political incentive to restrict how many people vote. It's the Republican Party. Because, more or less, higher turnout always favors Democrats, and so Republican state majorities around the country have every interest to restrict the availability of the vote. And it's precisely what they've set about doing. And in Ohio, get this, 2 years ago, Republicans tried to do just that, and it was Secretary of State Jon Husted who limited early voting on the weekend before the election to military personnel only.
John Husted has to feel like a twisted pretzel right now. The election is 5 weeks from the day, and he's been hammered with disagreements over the hours of early in-person voting and voting the weekend before the November 6th election. Husted bristles at the suggestion he's trying to suppress voter rights.
So it's a lot easier to vote in Ohio than it is in most states, and frankly, people should pipe down the rhetoric.
The state Democratic Party and the Obama campaign, armed with lawyers, fought back and filed a lawsuit. And a federal judge intervened, ordering the state to give all voters the right to cast their ballots in person on the final 3 days before the election day, including that Sunday. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected an appeal by Republicans. That was the precedent. Normal politics at the state level are no protection for the interests of voters who tend to be excluded by these voting restrictions. Those rights, as we've learned in case after case, not the least of which in Ohio 2 years ago, those rights must be protected by the courts. And that's why my next guest is taking his case to court for a rematch with Secretary of State Husted. Joining me now, Ohio Democratic gubernatorial candidate of Cuyahoga County, Executive Ed FitzGerald. Ed, Husted says, look, we've got a ton of early voting, and Republicans in the state are saying it's very expensive to keep this open. They're also saying this is bipartisan consensus. We solicited opinions. What's your beef here?
Well, you know, we're not really dealing with this problem in a vacuum. We know what happens when we don't have extensive early voting in Ohio, because you have the videotape. The world has a videotape of what it looked like in 2004 in Ohio when we didn't have evening voting, when we didn't have voting on the Sunday before elections. And this is predictable what's going to happen. And so there is clearly been a consensus among the voters themselves that they want to have these expanded hours because they've been using them in overwhelming numbers. And Chris, it's been working. I mean, we've had several elections in a row where we haven't had long lines at the polls, where people have been able to exercise their franchise. The problem, I think, from the Republican point of view is they haven't always gotten the results from those elections that they want, and so they're changing the rules again.
Oh, I want to play you the Ohio GOP chairman who appeared on our air earlier today to make the argument that it was too costly. Take a listen.
Having government offices open on weekends is an unusual thing. Try to go to the post office on a weekend, or try to go visit your congressman's office on a weekend on a Sunday. They're almost never open. Having to pay these folks overtime, all of this burden falls on the local elections officials. They're the ones who came to us. They're the ones who came to the Secretary of State and to the legislature and asked for some relief.
Your response to that?
is just absolutely absurd. First of all, how do you put a price tag on democracy? We know what happens when we don't fund these things appropriately. The state has a $60 billion plus budget. They can't find a way to help fund this. I mean, the ironic thing is, Chris, is that those counties that said that they would pick up the cost, like my county, one of the things that this legislation does is it actually prevents us from spending our own money that we've budgeted for these exact same purposes.
Wait, repeat that again?
Sure. So one of the things that the legislation that was just passed by the legislature and was just signed into law by Governor Kasich, it prohibits local boards of elections from funding, for instance, some of these things on their own, including the mailing of absentee ballot applications.
So just so we're clear, the GOP is making the argument that this is about cost, right? That they're making that this is unaffordable. You, as the person that represents the actual county that's implementing this, is saying you can pay for it, and the state law signed by Republicans prohibits you from making that decision to pay for this because you assess it's a need.
That's exactly right. The litigation that you referenced, Chris, back in 2012, my county was a party to that because we didn't want the Republicans to be able to make that false argument in front of the court. So we actually joined in that lawsuit to tell the federal court, hey, listen, this argument that they're making, it is complete baloney. We are willing to fund these things. We've already budgeted it. We want to be able to do this because our constituents, Democrats and Republicans, are asking us to do this. So it's a completely disingenuous argument on their part, and they know it.
What is the argument you're making in the lawsuit here? What is the constitutional or statutory claim you're making before the court?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's going to be very similar to what you saw in 2012, and that just is, it's basically pretty simple, that the voting franchise is sacred, it's special. We know what happens when we don't make full accommodations for voters like we did back in 2004, especially in urban areas where you have multiple precincts that are combined in one location, where you've had people waiting until 2 in the morning to have to vote. Their franchise, Chris, is effectively denied by these long lines at the polls. And we know this is a disease that we know what the cure is for.
Right.
And we have a chance to do it, and we should be allowed to do so.
Cuyahoga County Executive Ed FitzGerald, also a gubernatorial candidate in that state. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, coming up.
What I think it is with the DNC, with others both in the state and across the country, is they desperately want something negative to happen in Wisconsin. The reality is we're going to stay focused on the things we're elected to do.
Staying focused on the things we were elected to do, like, oh, I don't know, mocking welfare recipients when you were running for governor and then running the welfare program into the ground while you were governor? I'll explain next.